Thanks again, everyone, for joining. This is the October 19th monthly Watershed Division staff meeting. And we'll start with our Watershed Health Assessment Framework presentation. Go ahead, Beth.
All right,
Kevin,
thank you so much.
Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation to share the Watershed Health Assessment Framework with you all today. I'm excited to step through some example for newer users while also showing off some recent advancements. So this is what the WHAF team looks like, I guess, just to kind of share since we're not in the same room. I'm Beth Knutson, so I'm the project coordinator. I've been in that role for more than a decade, starting with project development and all the way through to our recent updates and improvements. Today, we also have Kevin and Jeff on the call. They're both pretty recent additions to our team, and we're happy to have them. Kevin is our research scientist and GIS analyst, and Jeff is our WHAF application developer. Dan O'Shea is another team member involved from the beginning, particularly with data analysis and statistics. So I'll be kicking off with some background and overview information. Then Kevin is going to step through a hands-on demo, and we'll wrap up with some examples that help evaluate watershed health conditions and challenges. So, and as I mentioned, Jeff is also here. He's listening for ideas to improve the map experience as well as help answer questions as they come up. As we go along, you can feel free to drop questions in the chat or raise your hand if you have something you'd like us to address or clarify. We'll try to address those as we go if we can, but we're also hoping to leave time at the end to circle back. So with that, our pre-survey showed that quite a few of you are not as familiar with the WHAF, so I'm going to share some slides that frame our approach and help get everyone familiar and on the same page as we get started. So stepping all the way back, what is the Watershed Health Assessment Framework? Well, our purpose with framework was to help us all manage for watershed health. So why do we do this work? Well, to support Minnesota's vision of healthier watersheds and communities. And then how are we doing that? Well, we're trying to build a better understanding of some key concepts like complexity and scale to help us tackle those difficult problems with creative solutions and to address the source of our health issues. So what is it that we deliver? Well, the WHAF synthesizes data into ecological health scores, and we do that to help show patterns across scales. Scores and data are delivered in this innovative web map that we're going to show off a bit today. And it's designed as a platform to encourage collaboration and understanding of watershed science. So here's where we deliver our information. The link in the middle there will take you right to our homepage. So the team manages this online platform that's within the DNR website. So in addition to the web map, the WHAF team delivers quite a few other products, including 3 major watershed scale reports that are used heavily by our own staff and hopefully agency partners. The watershed context report, the climate summary, and the health report card. And then more recently, we've added a land use analysis tool, and then we also have pages that cover some of those system science concepts, so you can dive into that a bit. We offer a newsletter about quarterly that gives updates, so the link for that is also on our homepage. Please sign up if you don't already receive it. And currently available for testing, we have a new application add-on that's called WHAF for Lakes, and we will be able to share a bit about that app today, as well as a link for testing. And then we've tried to enhance some of our user help resources. There's a help menu within the map. Now that's the help menu on the left. There's also a map guide that's a PDF version that can be downloaded. It shows kind of how to step through all the different tools. We've put together a process guide that shows the purpose of the tool and then a step-by-step example of a sequential investigation. And we've developed a larger library of use examples. So these are ways in which users have investigated watersheds with the WHAF. They give some guidance and examples of lessons learned. All right, before we jump into a demonstration of the map application, I wanted to do a quick review of these specific key concepts and how each has influenced how the WHAF is structured and delivered. So if we say we're going to help you manage for health, we thought we better start by defining what we mean when we say health for a natural system. I've always kind of liked this summary statement by Aldo Leopold that health is the capacity of the land for self-renewal. And to unpack that just a little bit, we are reminded that health is a functional state and not a static condition. We don't create a healthy system and lock it up so it stays that way. Heck, if you could lock in, I would have locked in at age 35, right? But instead, it's a system that requires connected flow of appropriate inputs and outputs. And that creates a system that can be disturbed and returned to a healthy condition. So building that resilience to disturbance. So a landscape that has those intact cycles and pathways that can deliver services over time and space are more likely to recover from stressors, right? Differences in health, though, involve things like tipping points and triggers, functional states and response mechanisms. So there's nothing really that simple about the term health, which leads us to the other concept, the next one of complexity. So one of the ways that we address complexity is to use the data that we all collect to pull out the patterns with these health scores. So catchment scale health scores make those patterns easier to view and understand, things that are hidden in the data a little more visible. And then the scores are also organized to represent aspects of 5 different ecological components, another way of addressing the complexity. In this example, we have data and scores that impact hydrology, water quality, and connectivity, using data that comes from DNR, PCA, and MnDOT. And then we also have scores for geomorphology and biology. But it adds value to the data we all collect. And then we have the concept of scale that you see front and center when you open the map. So as you begin exploring, the set scale tool is right there at the top. And it's designed to make scale a little easier. So you can see what's hydrologically related to the location you select. So the first thing you do is just click on the map. And once you've set that location, all the tools react dynamically to that. And you can symbolize and navigate to any of these watershed scales using the zoom button. Sorry about that. I had changed something about my screen here. This relationship of location, catchment boundary, and upstream and downstream relationships drives much of the data that we deliver within the WHAF. So hydrologic boundaries for your location can be pretty hard to visualize, but we hope that the WHAF makes that message a lot easier to share and deliver. We've also added this select all button that shows the nested relationships, and you can display all the nested scales together. So here, you're seeing the upper Mississippi River Basin mast, the major watershed outlined in white, the upstream contributing area or true watershed in bright blue, and your local catchment in pink. Downstream catchments in this example are filled in blue. So you can click anywhere on the map and it will redraw this same set of boundaries for a new location. Or if you've selected a unique way of symbolizing it out of this menu, it will hang on to that symbology at a new location. I use that a lot if I'm at an event where you are clicking around, people are interested in seeing what's upstream of a lake or a stream reach, and it just makes it quick and easy to share that messaging. So then we combine these two concepts, data as health scores and dynamic spatial boundaries. And the WHAF then lets the user easily view and zoom to other scales. So in this example, the Upper Mississippi Basin holds two different major watersheds outlined here in the black that have a very different range of scores for the percent perennial cover found in each catchment. And at this scale, the view also shows you that there's, such an obvious gradient in this health score over the entire basin. All right, so that's an introduction to kind of our basis for developing the tool. And we have a lot to cover in the next 45 to 50 minutes. So, and we do want to leave some time for Q&A. But here's an overview of what we hope to step through. We're going to focus on the lower Minnesota River watershed. And Kevin is going to step us through those tools in a live map demonstration to explore a location, and then to kind of focus in a little bit on the High Island Creek subwatershed. And then I'll return to review some ways that exploration can help evaluate watershed function and connection, and share ideas on how a full look at the system might be able to inform priority actions and locations. So with that, I'm going to put Kevin in charge and turn the screen over to him so he can demonstrate how to step through some of these actions in the map.
Thanks, Beth. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, and everyone can hear me. All right, so yeah, we're going to go ahead to start from our main WHAF page. We're going to go ahead and open up the watershed map. And Beth is going to drop a link into the chat with an actual URL to the map layout that I'm going to kind of step through the creation of here for your own reference if you want to look back at it later. But I figured a kind of live look at the creation of that layout that will kind of help add to our exploration a little bit would be good to get us a little familiarized with the layout of the application. So I'm gonna dive right in. No need to follow along or anything. I'm just gonna kind of walk through a lot of the features here. So as Beth mentioned, we're gonna start zeroing in on a particular place. I already have a catchment in mind that is within the lower Minnesota watershed. And so I'm going to use that search tab to go ahead and click on that catchment, and that will zoom right to that catchment. So then I'm going to click somewhere in there to set our location. You can see that now we get a pop-up with that location and the major river watershed as well as the basin there. And now we're going to go back to this Set Scale tab to focus our display here. So first, we're going to go ahead and fill in that catchment to kind of highlight it. We're going to outline the upstream area of that catchment, and we're going to mask the major watershed. And then I'm going to go ahead and zoom to the major watershed as well. And so now we can see we've got the major watershed outlined in dark blue here, the upstream area in light blue, and then that catchment that's down here and that purplish color. So the next step is we're going to add some additional data layers that will enhance our ability to kind of explore what's going on within this major watershed here. So we're going to go to this Add Data tab. You can see that there's a couple data layers that come preloaded in there, but we're going to go down to this All Data Layers to add some additional features. So first, we're going to just pull up a Streams and Rivers layer. Going to go ahead and add that. We're going to also add a lakes layer, and also let's go ahead and do the altered water courses layer as well. And so once we've got these data layers in here, we can show a little bit of the usability in here. Once we've got a layer added to these active data layers, we can turn it on and off without having to, just go ahead and delete the layer. So that's kind of handy if you if you want to click off the display, but you don't want to lose it. You can do that. We can also, by selecting a particular layer, so clicking on it, we can activate the ability to get additional feature information by clicking on individual features. And so that will pull up information about each one of these watercourse lines here. And by unselecting it, that will re-enable just the move functionality of the mouse. One more thing with layers here, we can also change the order that the layers are drawn in. And so I'm going to go ahead and pull this hillshade topography up and turn this on. And so this is something we include. It just helps kind of understand the landscape a little bit better. And so you can change the transparency of that and so forth. The next thing I want to cover is if we go to the Legend tab here, we can see that all these features and the symbology of them is labeled here on the right. And if we were going to want to, just take a static image of this map for a presentation or something like that, or just to share with someone, the easiest way to do that is just by taking a screen grab of it. And so if you're using a Windows, the easiest way to do that is if you're familiar with the snipping tool. If you're not, the shortcut for it is Shift Window key S. And so then that's going to enable the snipping tool. You'll get this little pointer, and we're just going to highlight the area that we want saved. And so then that's going to copy that image to our clipboard, which we can then paste into a Word document or a presentation or what have you. The other option for sharing is if you click this share button, aptly named, you can see a URL that is created for this exact layout that that I just walked you through the creation of here. And this is the exact URL that Beth dropped in the chat as I was initially going through this demo. And so with that, you can copy it, you can share it via email. And this is important to note because if you notice, the URL as I was adding things didn't change at all. So like if I were to click, refresh this page, it would go back to the original map layout without any features added. So if you're wanting to, bookmark this to save it for yourself, you're going to want to use this detailed URL. And just a couple extra things. Let's go ahead and collapse this. I want to point out that we can also change our base map in here. So like if you wanted to go to the aerial hybrid, you can add that in, go back to streets. And at any time, you can always go back in and set scale and, zoom to a different scale of interest. So like if we want to zoom out to the whole basin, we want to zoom all the way down into that catchment that I identified originally, can do that as well. And change your mask and so forth in there. So at this point, before I kind of go a little bit further into the health scores, does anybody have a quick question about just app navigation? And we can, if you want to save it for the end too, we can also address it then. But figured I'd take a pause here.
Yeah, Kevin, there was one question from Scott that asked if layers can be clipped to display only those within your selected scale. Can that ever be an option? And my response in the chat was that clipping's not available, but that masking at other scales can have a similar function. I don't know if either you or Jeff might have anything to add to that.
Yeah, unless Jeff has something, I would say I would go for the mask to kind of highlight the area that you're kind of focused in on, and then everything else kind of fades to the background a little bit. But yeah, I think that's probably your best bet.
Yeah, I would say, just as a side comment, I guess that that's somewhat intentional because, we're always trying to display that easy ability to cross scales. And so we don't want to cookie cutter out one location. And so it's part of the functionality, the way it sits. Although I understand if you're trying to, make a map of a very specific area, that may not give you exactly what you're looking for.
Yeah, kind of sacrifice in being nimble to jump across scales, that ability, but yeah. Okay, I guess I'll go ahead and dive into health scores a little more then. So if we go over, I'm gonna click on to the, sorry about that, click over to link that Beth created there. So if we go into this health scores tab, we can right away see kind of the hierarchy of the scores here. So we have each one of our 5 components: hydrology, geomorphology, biology, connectivity, and water quality. And so within each one of these components, there are a number of individual, what we call index scores, that make up that component. And if we then go up a level in the hierarchy, those index scores are then averaged together into these mean component scores. So we have a component score for biology, connectivity, and so on. And then again, those component scores are averaged together into the creation of a watershed, an overall watershed health score. And let's go ahead and dive a little more into one of the components here. So let's start with hydrology. Collapse that, and let's look at this altered watercourse index score. And so when we select that score, right away, point out that the data support being leveraged to create this score comes from the statewide altered watercourse project that MPCA obviously led. And what the score does is determines the proportion of stream lengths that are natural within each catchment or major watershed. And so right off the bat, want to point out that most scores, not all, are available at both the catchment and major watershed scale. And so if we were to zoom out to scale here, we could zoom out to the whole basin, and we'd see that they're summarized at the major scale as well as at that catchment scale. So go back to catchments here. And what this score does is it serves as an indicator of the loss of hydrologic storage. And for this, this is a good time to call out the scaling of the scores. So scores that are close to 0 or displayed in red here, those are indicative of low health. And then scores that are close to 100 and labeled in green here, we'll call that high health. And so in this particular case, the low scores would be those where there's high density of altered watercourses, whereas the higher scores, that would be high density of natural unaltered watercourses. And we'll go ahead and jump then over. Let's go over to a different component here. We'll go into geomorphology, and I'm going to go ahead and look at this steep slopes near stream score. And so this is a good time to point out that within each one of these scores, there's this About tab. And so if we were to click on that, we can get a little bit more details on how the score is calculated and also what what the score really means. And so for steep slopes near streams, this helps identify regions that are more susceptible to large sediment contributions from like bank erosion. While this is a really, tight explanation of that here, this is a score where if we jump over to this page that opens up and has a lot more details, that really comes in handy. So some of the scores there's a pretty simple, straightforward connection from the input data into what's rescored or rescaled into a health score. And then there's some like this score where there's a number of processing steps that are needed, as well as a number of input data sources that are used to compute this score. And so we can see lots of details about each one of the index scores right there. There's also tabs in here that you can use to kind of help interpret results, see relationships with other scores, and so on. So that's something good to keep in mind. Can always jump out to that easily from within the app. And let's jump over to one more component here. Let's go over to biology and some data that many of you are probably very familiar with. We have these stream species quality index scores for fish and invertebrates, and these scores are based on the stream IBI data. And so for this score, what we do, we take the raw IBI inputs and we rescale them in a way so they're all relative to the same threshold, and then that's comparable across this state. And if we go over to the legend here, something to call out in particular that's of interest in this score, you'll see that these catchments are coded, the same way, 0 to 100. But then we also have catchments that have this hashed symbology, and you may already be putting the pieces together here. But for this score, there isn't IBI data within every one of the catchments that we have coded here, but for those catchments that are adjacent and hydrologically connected to a catchment that does have a score, we went ahead and extrapolated that metric score into that adjacent catchment to kind of extend the utility and our coverage across the state there. And I think that's a good overview. I won't go through any more scores. I do want to point out, though, that a very useful tool in this is the Matrix tab, where if you select that, that will pull up a table with all the index scores at all scales for the selected area that you've picked. So I have this catchment selected here. If I were to select a different catchment, this matrix would reload then with data according to that scale then that I've collected or that I selected. You can, within this table, you can resort to see, high to low scores within each scale of interest. You can also take note of the highlighted rows or cells that we have here. We've highlighted any cell with a index score below 40 as just kind of an initial gut check flag to see if there's any scores that you want to dive into further. And I'll also note that you can download this table. And so I'm going to kick it back to Beth then, where she's going to take a portion of one of these downloaded tables and kind of walk you through a little bit more on how you can use the relationship of scores at each scale and what can kind of be gleaned from that further. So Beth, take it away.
All right, I'm going back in here. All right, are folks seeing a slide again?
Yep, we're seeing it, Beth.
All right, sounds great. So Kevin just showed you how to access the matrix from within the map, and I wanted to take a closer look at what this tabular comparison of health scores across scales can tell us. So this particular table that I pulled out has been sorted from low to high on the upstream scale. And when I look at these, I tend to look for discrepancies across scales. And remembering that low scores are less healthy or higher risk, and those things that are highlighted fall at 40 or below. So considered a lower score, perhaps worth taking another look at. So here's a couple examples. I pulled out altered watercourse, where you're seeing a catchment score of 82 in comparison to these low scores at other scales. So, basically that's telling us that the particular catchment where we dropped to that X in the map, has much more natural stream course occurring, but that the contributing area has been very highly altered, of course, with, and as we know, comes with altered flow regimes and a loss of storage. So you begin to think, how will that condition upstream impact a naturally meandering stream corridor at the mouth of this particular subwatershed? So how do you think about, maybe protecting that more natural condition, or how that's going to play out over time? And then another example then is, this kind of the opposite situation that you see in steep slopes near streams. So the catchment value is 0, meaning, I guess, across the state of Minnesota, this location is, has the, one of the steepest topographies near stream, and other areas of the watershed have a flatter topography. And I guess it really points to the idea that this particular catchment was kind of protected by its steep slopes from being altered into those intense land uses. It wasn't a little too steep for our typical productive uses. But then that steep topography might also expose the catchment some additional impact from all that alteration upstream. And I've noticed this pattern is pretty common in Minnesota, and I know we realize this, but sometimes we just don't really think about the fact that so many of our watersheds, especially down here in the southeast where I live and work, the upper portion of the watershed is much flatter, and they have that really intense land use. That's where the alteration has occurred. And then they they're the more intact communities are those steep areas that are downstream, and it kind of flips the story of thinking about impacts accumulating as you move from the pristine upstream areas as they all accumulate and move downstream. Rather, it seems that a lot of our healthier downstream systems are just trying to function in spite of some of the dysfunction that is happening upstream. And then the last example that I pulled out is perennial cover, which we all know is going to be consistently low across scales. So when you see a score that has very little variability, there's probably not much local action that's going to make a difference in a condition that is that pervasive. I mean, it can be discussed, there may be things you can do, but it might be a challenge that will need something more like a policy shift in order to facilitate change at a scale, at a broad landscape scale that's really going to make a difference in establishing more perennial cover across the state of Minnesota. So those are some ways to just kind of parse through a table like this and pull out things that you want to investigate further. So that table gives you kind of a snapshot of overall health. But then there's some other things that I like to try to pull out from the map. And I often think about some of these things as responses. So we measure water quality or biology, stream species, as kind of an indicator of how well the system is doing. Are the streams handling what the landscape is dishing out? In the add data menu that Kevin just demonstrated, you can find these data layers on impaired streams and impaired lakes. And when you use the impaired streams layer, you'll find that all of the different impairment types on each stream reach are labeled in the map. And you can see in the legend a description of what the symbology means. And the same is true of the lakes. And then Kevin just placed another URL. So I don't know if we explained that well, but if you click on the URL, it will generate the map you're seeing on the slide in your own browser. So that will show you a picture of this High Island Creek subwatershed and the impaired streams and lakes within it. And sometimes, you kind of see this cascade of water quality impairments as you move downstream. Other times we've noted that there seems to be a decrease of impairments downstream of unusually large protected or natural lands. So you can kind of look for those kinds of patterns. But you can also use the WHAF to view each water quality impairment by type. So in this case, I decided to pull out the bacteria impairments in High Island Creek and added the data for feedlots. So I don't know, I think this is a really strong improvement to the WHAF when we added all of the individual impairment data layers, because it was always difficult for us within the DNR to be able to know more than just it's impaired, but to be able to explore by impairment type. It's impaired for what and where. So this has really helped us look at those questions of how these things connect. So as I said, this is the impairment for bacteria with the feedlot data. And the image in the lower right of the slide that shows the all data layers, again, you note that there's a drop-down menu to filter the data layers you want to add by some different topics. So if you click on assessments and impairments, you'll get just those data layers to look through. Otherwise, there's a lot of data to try to find exactly what you want. You can also use the box on the left to search through data layers by name. So if you're looking for a specific impairment, you can start by typing there and it'll come up with that match. You can also use, the mask that's active here to click on a stream reach and see which landscape area is contributing to that surface water or feature. So that makes for a pretty straightforward desktop exploration. And as you recall, Kevin showed how to highlight the feedlot data layer in that list of layers and then click on a feature to see the attributes. So from this map, you can also find specific feedlot information like animal type, number of units, the owner, etc. So there's a lot that you can glean pretty quickly in a desktop exploration. So then I started thinking about ways to explore this particular subwatershed, focusing more on biological attributes, or terrestrial attributes. And here you can see a lot of the remaining high quality terrestrial communities, as well as some of the stream protection priorities. So our team has been active in how those protection priorities were created together with PCA and a team inside of DNR, but our team continues to publish the updates to those priorities annually. But these are stream reaches that do not already have an impairment, but are, well, nearly barely, right, close to the threshold, and are at greatest risk from watershed conditions, both near stream and upstream conditions. So those at highest risk are prioritized as the highest priority to protect. And as you look at the locations where some of these higher quality features are located, you see again that those steep lands and riparian areas near the main stem and the Minnesota River, and they hold a lot of the remaining natural communities. And as sometimes happens to me as I'm doing these explorations, I started looking at just some information about this particular sub-watershed. And if you notice that pink triangle, that marks the location of the High Island Creek Dam that failed in 2014. And I couldn't resist digging a little deeper into that story, as our unit, the River Ecology Unit, is always looking at ways to examine the impacts of changes in aquatic connectivity. So here's the story that I found. The dam was built in 1958 to limit carp. But carp were found upstream through sampling, and it was determined that, in fact, instead, it was a barrier to 33 of the native species that were found to be absent above the dam. So the dam washed out in a flood in 2014, and it was not rebuilt based on that understanding. And a stream restoration project took place there in 2015. So this seemed like an important local example for this sub-watershed that showed the importance of, well, first off, the long-term monitoring that we were all involved in. Both PCA and DNR had data to bring to that question. And then how important it is to look at systems as they change over time, so our management can kind of shift as we understand more about how the system is functioning. And then thinking about actions that actually create greater resilience in our systems and can push the dial in the right direction, even when the measurable benefits may be out in the future. So I know it can be difficult when funding and reporting cycles are expected on pretty immediate timescales. Knowing that the work to improve natural systems creates responses that march at their own speed, sometimes as fast as a single flood or that native minnow species that quickly raced up to see those new river miles, and sometimes as slow as the 50 years of data collection before that decision was made. So while it's not always the easiest to sell to our funders and managers, increasing connectivity and diversity are really key pieces of resilience that we try to consider as foundational for making sustainable improvements to health, even when they pay many of their dividends in the future. So here's another look at our current landscape of investments in protection at the major watershed scale. So zooming back out and masking to the lower Minnesota watershed. I've added the DNR base map, which is just one of our selection options within the map environment. And it's a quick way to see where some of our public lands and management areas are. And I brought in some of those high quality and high protection areas. So again, you see our public dollars have focused a lot on the river corridor and the remaining high quality natural communities in that riparian zone. But knowing with our examination that, you know, this is heavily agricultural in the western half, and the urban expansion is occurring in the northeastern part of this watershed, you know, how is that going to affect these investments? Can riparian areas absorb water flow and sediment contaminants when they're so isolated within an altered landscape? So are there opportunities to prioritize connectivity to improve health, and in doing so, expand resilience to an increasing spectrum of conditions, including climate conditions? So speaking of climate, that is one of the areas that we were asked to share more about from the survey that I shared with you all. And I just wanted to point out some of the climate products that we do have, because one of the ways to get at them is to go to our homepage, and that left-hand menu that's circled watershed reports in the middle, that menu is the same no matter which page of our website you're on, and you can click on there, and that is one way to access the watershed reports. And if you go at it that way, you'll see this topic, Climate Summary for Watersheds, and there are some additional climate resources that you can access that way. So you can also get at, you know, our context reports and health report cards, but this is where you'll find that major watershed climate summary We also have a statewide climate summary. So this is work that's based on historic climate data. So it's data that's been tracked since 1895, I believe. And then there's a climate supplement that's been written in conjunction with our climatology staff that help interpret those reports. So what are we really saying about climate when you look at the report for your particular watershed that you're interested in? And then I wanted to point out these climate change animations, because this is really the only link that we have to these. I'm looking for a way to make them a little more accessible, but they're on this page. It says animated maps, and if you click on that, you'll get to these animations. And these are animated GIFs that show change on a 30-year sliding time scale, beginning in 1893 to 1924, that 30-year increment, and then it moves across time, and the first image is one you see on the left and the last image on the right, and it will, move that through time. And I think Kevin dropped those links in there. I'm not going to try to run one because sure as heck I'll lock up Teams if I do. But if you access that through the Watershed report page, there are a number of these that show not just annual change, but seasonal change. Really a nice outreach product if you just want to start that conversation about how much change we have already measured in Minnesota. And then there's a couple other pieces of climate data that are available in the app. Again, in the add data, using that filter function, you can click on climate and find the data layers easily that we have already added to the map. One of those I'm showing here is the minimum temperature, and we look at the departure from record. So that's the minimum, the most recent 30 years of data. 1989 to 2018, how much it departs from the entire climate record starting in 1895. And then some of that same information is in the climate summary report on the right. So again, looking at minimum temperature as the factor, we'll have a page that shows you the average, the change over time, and the chart on the bottom. And then on the next page is this departure by season, and you can see that the departure is greatest in the winter months, which is a statewide trend that we're all aware of, I'm sure. So you can access a lot of this information directly inside the map environment as well in the Charts and Reports tab under, if you are focused on the Reports tab that you see in the upper right. If you select Charts, we have a couple of new things going on here. You can launch a land cover application that summarizes land cover, and not yet available, but coming soon, you'll be able to launch the WHAF for lakes from the charts as well. So here's a look at what's available in the land cover application. So again, this is available at different spatial scales. So in this case, we're selecting the upstream of the same catchment that we were looking at earlier in the live demonstration. And you can select different summaries of NLCD based on year and on an expanded cover type. And it also shows here one of the newer products is that crop history, which was designed to help illustrate that shift from row crop, small grain, and hay, which are those three large categories that are listed there, from the 1800s to current, obviously showing in most locations that it's the row crops that are so dominant at this point in time, but sometimes that the time at which that occurred helps to explain some of the other changes that we have experienced. So that one's been kind of interesting to dive into. And lastly, here's a sneak peek at the WHAF for Lakes new application. Hand clap for Jeff. He's been working really hard to get this thing up and running, and we're working with our Lakes Ecology unit on the content for this. It's being shared as a preview, so there's a link that Kevin dropped in the chat, so you can take a look at this. And that link also includes a survey, so please take the survey if you'd like. We'd love to hear back on anybody that takes a look at it. Here's what the first page will look like when you open it. We selected major watershed, again, the lower Minnesota, and then you'll get a list of all of the lakes that have a health score within that scale. In this case, I kind of highlighted High Island Lake, and that has a health score of 40. So you go, wonder what that means. I'm going to click on High Island, and it will zoom you to that selected lake and give some basics about the lake, as well as the scores that went into generating that overall health score. And then you can dive into the subcomponents across the top. So, for example, here's water quality for that lake. And you can see some of the metrics. And if you expand that about the score or about the data, we have a lot of background on how this work was done. And lastly, I just wanted to point out that we leveraged the water clarity data that's delivered by the University of Minnesota in their Lake Browser app to provide a summary of water clarity over time. Whew, I feel like we covered a lot, and I hope that was helpful as we all look toward moving to healthier watersheds, and that the WHAF can be helpful for examining the system as we think about the parts and the processes and connections that work together in a watershed. So we didn't leave quite as much time as I was hoping, but if we have some questions, we're available to stick around. So
Thank you very much, Beth and Kevin and Jeff. Any questions? And if not today, Beth, can folks reach out to your group after today?
Anytime. There is a link to our team on the homepage. So you can do it that way. That will get, we all get that and respond to it. We'll shuffle it to whoever needs to answer, or you can, of course, reach out to any of us individually. And the other thing that, I would ask is if you've been using the WHAF or you do use it and have an experience you'd like to share with us, it's an online application. We do not.
Oh, you just dropped off, Beth, there. I'll just chime in.
Let me know.
There you go. We just lost you, Beth. But Beth was just saying if you have any uses that have you found it useful for something, or you have any new ideas, suggestions, even it's always just very helpful to hear that for the project going forward, both from a support side of it's getting utility as well as to improve it going forward.
Say, Beth and Kevin, this is Scott Nemo up in Brainerd, and thank you for the presentation. And it's been a while since I've been on the WHAF, but wow, what great progress you guys have made on the tool. It really is a real comprehensive tool, and it has got to be very useful for our purposes in monitoring and assessment. I know it is. It must be challenging just keeping up with the various layers and coverages that you're using to update the tool. Is there a way to see kind of what the latest layer is that you're using? Is that kind of in the metadata then?
Yeah, I would say so. For each one of the scores, if you're navigating the app and you go into that additional details page, you'll see a link to the actual the data source. Like that, we have up on GeoCommons or a resource that has all of our scores in it compiled together, and there's additional details on what was used to calculate them. And as far as the add data layers, there's a data sources page that's also available. I can, after we jump off and lose our time here, I can post links to both of those places. But yeah, I mean, we try and keep as abreast of new data as possible. Sometimes the add data layers is a little quicker to update with new inputs, as there's not as much of a computational lift on our end for that. But the scores, you know, for particularly for scores that we know are regularly updated with new information, we try and you know, keep on those. Like in particular, just one of the ones that jumps out is like perennial land cover and impervious cover. We, you know, try and be as nimble as we can to update as new NLCD data and stuff come up for that.
Thanks, Kevin.
And if you have a particular question about a layer or something like that, don't hesitate to just shoot us a message.
You bet.
All right, looks like we have Beth back on. Any other questions in the last couple minutes? I will say, I didn't do this myself, but I watched it done. Pulling the land cover out of the WHAF seemed to be, for a particular catchment or sub-watershed, seemed to be very efficient, very productive. So I can, I guess, vouch for that at least. I've been using the WHAF a little bit here and there, not regularly, but seeing that done was very cool.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Good to hear that, Scott.
Yeah, thanks. And that timing on getting kicked out was pretty amazing for me. I guess we were about done. I have no idea what happened in our Lake City office, but I'm back. But thanks so much for the opportunity to share. And yeah, and just one more plug to have you take a look at the Lakes app too, if you have an interest in that, and we'll be looking at those survey results. So any feedback is always welcome. So thanks so much.